In today's video, we are heading to my friend and fellow photographer Andy's studio in Sheffield to shoot with the amazing model Ethan. So admittedly, shooting in the studio has never really been my strongest forte or my strong point. As much as I love doing it, especially now in months like this where, you know, it's darker and it's colder and the weather's not great, I just don't have as much confidence in using artificial light, in using a studio setup as I do shooting on location with natural light. And of course, if you then add shooting film to the mix, the prospect of shooting with strobes, of shooting studio lighting, of shooting in low light situations becomes, you know, that little bit scarier than it was before. So you might remember a little while back a video I made on the channel where I tested using strobe lights with the Mamiya RZ67 for the first time. Since then, I have shot in the studio with strobes and film a handful of different times, some of which I have put on the channel already. But in today's video, we're going to be shooting a mixture of strobes in the studio and natural light in the studio. A big shout out to Andy and Sam for letting me use their studio space, their backdrops, etc. for this one. Andy will also have a video coming out on his channel about this shoot, so if you are interested in giving that a watch, I'll link that in the description. So once Ethan had arrived and we'd gone through styling options, starting with a really classic vest and jeans look that went with the classic looking hand-painted backdrop that Andy and Sam had available, we created a lighting look that looked equally as classic. So we positioned a newer Vision 4 strobe light in the window, basically right next to I think there's like 3 big windows, and we positioned it right next to it just to add to that window light. And the newer Vision 4 is actually the light that I used in the first video that I shot on strobes. I'll link that in the description. So with the Vision 4, we had a big softbox helping to diffuse the light and, you know, for it to seamlessly kind of blend into the natural light that we had coming in. Having all of that directional light as well and no light coming from the other side helped to create some really nice shadows on the other side of Ethan's face. So I personally always like to move my model away from backdrops, whether that's on location or in the studio, and create a little bit of compression between the model and the backdrop. And of course, when you're using a light source that is near to the model, this helps to kind of diffuse that shadow a little bit more and have a softer shadow. I started off by firing off some shots with my digital camera, the Sony a7 III, with the Sigma 35mm 1.4 lens for Canon with the MC11 adapter. I will link that in the description because that is quite a mouthful. And this was really just to test the lighting setup. Obviously, when you're shooting with strobes and film, well, when you're shooting with film ever, you can't see the photos until you get developed. And when you're shooting with strobes, you don't really know what the lighting looks like until you see the photo. So just to kind of ease my own anxieties, I started off shooting with digital, testing the light, and then I also just transferred the settings that I had on digital over to my Mamiya RZ67 so that I kind of knew that I was getting the exposure right. Once that was done and I was happy with the light and how I wanted it, and I was confident in the settings that I was going to use, I mounted the strobe trigger onto the hot shoe of my Mamiya RZ67 Pro II, which is my newest camera, and it's the first time I've used this camera with strobes. Previously, I'd only shot strobes with the Mamiya RZ67, not the Pro II version, and that doesn't have a hot shoe, so I had to kind of wire up the strobe to the lens, whereas with the RZ Pro II, you can literally just put the trigger on the hot shoe like you would a digital camera, and it works like that. So the first couple of shots were shot with the 110mm 2.8 lens, which is my go-to for portraits. It's my favorite portrait lens. I just love how flattering this lens is. It really complements face as well. So in terms of film stocks, for the strobe work, I used Kodak's Gold 200, obviously in 120 format. You guys will know that ever since they released this back in spring, it's been kind of my go-to film stock, especially for portraits. I really love the colours, and it's an ideal kind of film stock to use in the studio as well because it's got such a low ISO. So I was really happy with these first couple of shots that I got with this setup, but I wanted to push myself a little bit further outside of my comfort zone. And so I decided to switch to a lens that I had never used before, the 50mm 4.5. So this lens is much wider than the 110mm, obviously 50 and 110, they're like more than half. For context, the 110mm is roughly equivalent to a 55mm on 35mm format, whereas the 50mm lens is roughly equivalent to like a 25 on 35mm format. So using something this wide is not something I would usually opt for, whether I was shooting digital, 35, medium format. It's just not a lens or focal length that I'm kind of familiar with, especially for portrait work. It was definitely a struggle for me to get used to how wide it was compared to the 110. I find that when you really get used to using a lens, it becomes almost like an extension of the way you see. Like when you're looking for photos, you can almost envision how they're going to look because you're so familiar with how that lens works and how that lens captures and makes photos. It kind of becomes like second nature. But of course, this being my first time that I'd used this lens, the 50mm lens, it was definitely kind of a struggle for me to envision how I was going to use it and really nail my compositions. Like I kind of had an idea in my head about how I wanted something to look, but I was struggling to kind of translate that. And I think the thing that happens when you're working with new gear and you're working with models that maybe you've not worked with before and you kind of have an audience watching you shoot, you don't kind of have the time in the same way to really nail what it is you're shooting. You don't have kind of the luxury of taking ages to set up the shot and really going about it like that. You have a little bit more pressure on you to get things right a little bit quicker than maybe if you're doing street or you're working with a model that you know and that knows your work really well. That being said, it was really nice to try the lens, to test the lens out, and for me to be able to start exploring the intricacies of this lens. I'm looking forward to shooting with it a little bit more and hopefully getting my head around just how wide it is and how I can use that for portraits. So next up, it was time to bring out the Portra 800 and start shooting with natural light. So before I started getting comfortable with shooting with strobes with film, I would always shoot my indoor stuff with natural light. So just like when I was working with the strobes, I started off testing the kind of scenarios with my digital camera first. In terms of light source for this one, we just had the window lighting, so those three, I think it's three, it might be four, but those windows on the far side of the room. Those windows let in loads of light, especially when you were shooting a little bit closer to the windows, and I just moved the strobe out of the way so that it wasn't blocking, there was nothing blocking the light other than, you know, maybe me at some point. Of course, when you're shooting in natural light on film, it's much easier than with strobes, because you can see what you're shooting, where the light falls and all of that stuff before you get the photos back. But that being said, shooting with natural light obviously also has its limitations in that, you know, you can't control it as easily, and also sometimes there's not enough light. This was definitely the case in some of the instances where I moved Ethan away from the window light further back into the room to shoot against this panel. The amount of light that was getting to this part of the room wasn't a massive amount, and so that meant I was having to shoot at much slower shutter speeds than I would usually opt for, especially using the 50mm lens, because that only stops down to 4.5. So I didn't kind of have the luxury of being able to stop down to 2.8 like I did with the 110. And because of this slow shutter, some of these aren't as sharp as I maybe wanted them to be. And when it came to the wider lens for these shots, I definitely feel as though I couldn't really find my way as much. I think a lot of that was to do with the angle as well that I was shooting at, having to shoot at a slow shutter, looking through a waist level viewfinder and holding the camera at a weird angle, because the lens was so wide, made it really difficult to kind of nail that shot. For the shots where Ethan is sat against this palette, the digital shots I actually prefer to the film shots, and that's not really something I usually find. I know with the strobes, I still prefer the film over the digital. And then to finish off the roll, we headed outside to shoot the final couple of photos in a different look. One that complemented kind of like the darker scenes outside, still shooting obviously with the Portra 800, and I just opted to play it safe, play it within my comfort zone, and stick with the 110mm lens for these shots. Shooting natural light, shooting with this lens, shooting in these kind of environments, this is really my comfort zone. So it was nice to kind of get out there and shoot a couple where maybe I wasn't as worried about the settings, I wasn't really worried about being outside of my comfort zone. But yeah, you know, it's important to step outside your comfort zone. It's something that I try to do as often as I can. It's what makes you a better photographer. It's what makes you learn. It's what makes you, you know, grow. And hopefully you don't think I did too bad a job with the wide shots. Definitely something I want to get used to a little bit more. But another massive thank you to Andy, another massive thank you to Ethan, who is a model with IMM. an amazing agency that are based in the UK, and they have loads of models, you know, across the country, but mostly in London and Manchester. So I'll tag them alongside Ethan, alongside Andy, in the description of today's video. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one.